as we get started. Thanks everyone for joining the Zoom meeting. I know we haven't had a meeting and we really haven't had an in-person meeting in a very long time. But for now, we're gonna have to be doing Zoom meetings because of the current situation. We decided to have one right now because there's a few things happening in the world that I thought it would be helpful to get some information on. So we do have 3 speakers today. We're going to start out with Dr. Doucet, who is the chief of the Division of Trauma and Surgical Critical Care, Burns and Acute Care Surgery at UCSD. He is also one of the governors for our chapter and also is very involved in state advocacy efforts. So we're going to start with Dr. Doucet.
All right, thanks, Jeannie. I'll just share my slides here and get this underway. So I'm going to talk about the what's going on at the state level, or what will be going on at the state level this year, and talk a bit about state advocacy issues here in California. So, Dr. Liepert in a few moments is going to talk to you about the federal and national level advocacy. And there is a lot of interplay between the state and federal levels. Various laws get bounced back and forth. So for instance, California passed surprise billing law, and some of those bills and laws in California were used at the federal level as well. And so those things, pre-authorization is another thing that's going to bounce back and forth, and Medicaid expansion. So some of these things will be common to both and go in phases. Often the state passes the law first, then the Congress passes a law, and then the state has to adjust their law as a result. So some of these things are a continuous cycle. But what's on the horizon and what's coming down our California desert road? So some of the themes are the same as last year and won't change a lot. So one obviously is going to be pandemic and pandemic response. And that's been interesting because the state legislature has used the pandemic to, under emergency authorizations and whatnot, to push things through that in past years would not have gone through, and change some rules and regulations about things. And so that's allowed the legislature a lot more freedom to do things that in previous years they probably would not have passed. Last year, we had a scope of practice bill for nurse practitioners. That was AB 890. The CMA and the chapters of the College of Surgeons opposed that expansion of nurse practitioner scope of practice. Well, we lost, and it's passed. And now the CMA is trying to work directly with the regulators to see whether or not there can be a little bit more control there over what's going to happen, because the law as written gives a lot of scope of practice to nurse practitioners, and it definitely has some concerns for us. The sex organ modification bill that came out in 2019 is back. We'll talk about that. There'll probably be some more cancer screening bills, although we haven't seen what they are yet. Medi-Cal expansion is an ongoing topic, and there are a lot of folks on the Democratic side of the legislature who want to bring in some type of universal health care coverage as well. So far, we've seen 751 bills rolled out. There will be probably close to 3,000 bills in the legislature this session. Probably the one that's going to have the most impact, if it were to pass, is AB 4, which would basically give Medi-Cal benefits to everybody, regardless of age or immigration status. So it wouldn't just be for children and those over 65. Everybody in California who met the income requirements, regardless of their citizenship status, would qualify under Medi-Cal. So that's going to be a pretty substantial change. The previous version of this bill was thought to be in the vicinity of $3.2 billion, but this bill is actually even somewhat bigger. And we haven't seen how much the analyst thinks this bill would cost us. Dr. Pan, who's a Democratic senator and the only physician in the Assembly and Senate, has introduced a bill to call racism a public health crisis in California. That's going to be SB 17. AB 32 would make the current flexibility allowed under current billing rules for Medi-Cal and other state insurances there's some leeway to allow billing for that, to make those changes permanent. And there's also talk of that in other states as well. So what that AB 32 would make some of the provisions allowing us to bill into telehealth permanent. State Bill 225, this is from Senator Wiener, who brought in a similar bill in 2019. And the idea is that children under 6 cannot participate in a decision about their sexual identity, and therefore all surgery outside of that required to avoid harm should be avoided on children's genitals. Last time this bill was strongly opposed by the CMA, by the societies for pediatric urology, as well as the chapters, because basically they're directly legislating surgical practice, and we think that's an overreach, and the bill is really very likely unnecessary and would ban even simple things like hypospadias repairs and things like that. So, so this is probably going to be opposed as well, although the different societies, the CMA and the pediatric urologists are still looking at it. There are some bills to do with pandemic. One is, for instance, for people being licensed to have out-of-state licenses, they don't have to have all of their necessarily all their exams in place if they have a state license during the pandemic. AB 369 is a bill that allows street medicine and allows Medi-Cal to be billed, even though there's no referring doctor or no family doctor. It still allows, for instance, emergency doctors or other specialists on the street to do direct care of the homeless without having to comply with all the Medi-Cal rules. And then State Bill 250 is the pre-authorization bill, also brought in by Dr. Pan. This bill would basically say that insurance companies have to evaluate physicians for compliance with pre-authorization rules. And if they're good, they should be signed off for a 2-year period. And then basically all the pre-authorizations should be automatically approved. And then after 2 years, that gets reviewed. And then if they're overall having a good record, they continue to not need pre-authorization. So there's going to likely be pre-authorization bills at the federal level as well. But this would be a big step forward, I think, particularly for those in primary care who have to deal with multiple pre-authorization calls per day. The bill is complex, though, and I'm not sure how many folks are going to understand it. But if Dr. Pan can get this through, it would be probably an improvement in a lot for a lot of our primary care colleagues. There is no Stop the Bleed bill currently in the legislature. I don't think there will be one unless things change drastically. So there's just probably too much difficulty getting that through probably during the pandemic, and maybe as next year as the pandemic settles down, we'll have a chance at it. But I don't think there's a lot of bandwidth for this right now. Just a couple of things I'm going to mention about your role as chapter members and as surgeons and prospective surgeons. How do politicians work? Well, they're basically motivated by 2 things. Their constituents, those are the folks who voted for them and are part of their constituency. And you can act as a constituent by using surgeon's voice. So you'll get emails from the college asking you to send a letter to your elected representatives, and that's quite easy to do. Literally takes less than a minute. The letters are pre-made online. You basically just log in, you click on the letter you want to send, and it basically automatically picks out your representatives and sends that to them. And that basically really does work. You get responses from the representatives. They track how many of these letters they get, and they use that to understand what the grassroots is thinking about a particular bill or issue. And that's quite important for us because there's a lot of bills out there that could potentially affect us. For the PAC, the Political Action Committee, these are basically organizations that give money to politicians so that they can run campaigns. And so that usually gives you an opportunity to discuss things with the politician. And our Surgeons PAC is the organization that does that. The amount of participation in the PAC is really important because politicians look at that. When the PAC member comes to talk to them, they ask them, well, how many members, how many surgeons give to the PAC? If they say that only 1% of California surgeons contribute to the PAC, they're going to say, well, you guys aren't serious because the trial lawyers, 80% of them contribute to their PAC. And so we should listen to them, not to you. So That's basically the hard facts of the game. And so the PAC is important. It is important that we show participation. And it's not even so much about how much money you give. It's just the fact that you gave something so that the percentages are there. And so these are the tools. This is a surgeon's voice, what it looks like. Dr. Liepert may expand on this a bit, but basically once you log in, you just click on the topic that you want to send a letter about. You click on the letter you want to send, and it basically sets it all up for you. Literally takes less than a minute to engage on an issue. Folks get upset about the PAC because, oh, you gave money to Democrats. Oh, you gave money to terrible, terrible Republicans. Well, the fact of the matter is that's how it works. You have to get people on both sides of the aisle to vote for issues sometimes. Bills have much better chance of success if they have some bipartisan support. And most of the issues we're talking about require both sides of the House to work together. And so it does, the PAC makes us visible. The PAC is well known on Capitol Hill, and it's really important that as grassroots members that we contribute to make the PAC strong. It doesn't pick out particular parties. It doesn't pick out specific members. It basically sticks to the issues, and it basically contributes to candidates who are going to push forward an issue that's important to us. And it does not participate in presidential elections. So how can you become more engaged as a surgical advocate? Well, if you're interested in this topic, there's a great summit called the ACS and Leadership Advocacy Summit. It goes on in April or May. I forget. I think it's May this year. This year, of course, it's going to be online because of the pandemic. That makes it easier for folks to attend. They don't have to go to Washington to do it. Use the surgeon's voice when you see those emails from the college. Click on them and just follow the links. And within a minute, you can send your representatives exactly what you want, what you think on an issue. That they'll usually come out as these calls to action. You can also join the advocacy team. You can participate in your state or at federal level if you're interested in. Most years we have a state lobby day. I'm not sure this year if we're going to be able to have one because they haven't relaxed the rules at the Capitol yet. But in most years we do go to the Capitol, and all three chapters, Southern California, Northern California, and San Diego Imperial will go and talk directly to representatives about our issues. Obviously, if you're into social media, you can be involved with that. Both the chapter has a Twitter website, as does the college and the Surgeon's Voice. If you have a chance to talk to politicians about surgical issues, then do so. And you might know one, you might have one in your neighborhood, you may have a chance of talking about it. And then always consider giving a contribution to the PAC as well. And again, it's not always about the amount. Sometimes it's just the participation. If we can show ourselves to be a responsive group, we'll get more attention at the federal level as well. I'm going to quit there, and I'm going to turn it over to Jeannie to introduce Dr. Liepert.
Thanks for that, Dr. Doucet. I forgot to mention, if anybody in the audience has questions, there's two mechanisms by which you can ask them. One is the Q&A button, which you should see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The other is the chat. I'm going to be monitoring both of them for all the speakers. So if you have any questions or comments, please leave them there, and we will try to address as many of them as we possibly can. Our next speaker is Dr. Liepert. She joined us last year from Wisconsin in our division of trauma, surgical critical care, burn, acute care surgery. She's actually the leader in our acute care surgery group. She's here to talk about national advocacy efforts that are currently going on within the American College of Surgeons. She's been involved in those areas for several years now. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Liepert.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Lee. If I can get this. Can you guys see those?
Working good. Yeah.
Great. Well, I want to say hello and nice to meet those of you that I haven't met before. If you can see me, this is Myrtle, my dog here next to me. Excited I'm home for the evening. I've been very involved in advocacy for a long time, dating back to when I was a medical student and a resident. So I've gotten involved in the college for a long time, and have been involved at the national level for most all of that time. And I'm slowly learning the ways of California politics, and thank Dr. Doucet and the chapter for the opportunity to join in that. So just a quick slide on why to engage in advocacy. Why the heck have I done this for so long? And why do I continue to think that it's important, and encourage all of you to join in? And I'm happy to have anyone reach out to me for my experience or thoughts on it. But healthcare is constantly changing with or without the input of surgeons. So if we don't want to be at the table, we will be on the table, as the legislature and the federal government demonstrated last year, and they will continue to demonstrate this year. When it comes to surgical issues, of course, we're the experts on surgery and surgical processes and surgical payment and surgical patients. And so if we want to have those patients well taken care of and have given quality care, we need to be their advocates as well. So to expand on what Dr. Doucet said, that what do legislators listen to? Absolutely their constituents, but we are also representatives of our patients, so we can represent more of our legislators' constituents in that view as well. We oftentimes know what is best, not only for the patients, but for the medical and surgical profession. And we see the changing trends and challenges in healthcare. And when you speak with legislators and you can tell them specifically what makes taking care of patients difficult and the things that they do that are affecting it and making it harder, they listen to that. That's actually very impactful perspective on the patient perspective. And then we bring credibility to healthcare issues. They really do trust and respect surgeons. They understand that we're the leaders in the hospital on a day-to-day basis, and we are that trusted community source. So we can use that to our advantage with our legislators as well. And quite frankly, they want to hear from us and you specifically what it's like to be practicing in your practice and how that will affect the patients, their constituents. My greatest activities within the college have been within advocacy, and particularly in the past 6 years, I've been a member of the Health Policy Advocacy Group. And I think advocacy is a little bit unclear to a lot of people in the college. It's a little bit of the smaller division. It's getting more and more recognition currently. For those of you who don't know, there is a college-owned building in DC on F Street. It's a very beautiful building. So if you're in DC, they're happy for you to stop by, at least when the pandemic resolves. And there's an entire staff of folks who work there in DC. It's just a block or so from the Capitol. And so it's a great resource that we have as the college. And the college really is well respected on Capitol Hill. And so that is a great advantage. The Health Policy Advocacy Group is really sort of the executive group that is appointed by and reports directly to the Board of Regents and Board of Governors. And we sort of hear advisory from the Legislative Committee, the General Surgery Coding and Reimbursement Committee, the Health Policy Advisory Council, which is sort of the grassroots group that anyone can join. And I would encourage you, if you have interest, to join that group. And then the Surgeons PAC Board of Directors also reports to the HPAG. So what the heck do we do at these meetings? The HPAG meets about 4 times a year, and a little bit more virtually and via phone. Even outside the pandemic, we were doing that. And so each year when we meet for our early in the year meeting, these are about the amount of issues that we go through. And so it's about a day and a half, 12 hours and 6 hours in a conference room. There's about 25 of us in the whole DC staff. And we go through what are all the issues and we prioritize them. We learn a lot, we discuss a lot. And this is sort of how the college functions to pick what is the active issues at the national level that the college is going to focus on. Obviously, there's a lot of things that we wish we could do, but we have to pick strategically where the efforts are going to be most used. And so this is just really a list of demonstrations so you all have an idea of what that is. Last year, clearly the issue that became to the forefront was the Medicare physician payment and the proposed cuts to physicians. And it wasn't all physicians, it was specifically surgeons. And why the heck was that? Is that because Congress got upset about surgeons making too much money? Really, it's not. But what they wanted to do was raise payments for primary care, internal medicine, and some of the procedural based specialties. The problem with that is the budget has to be balanced. And so if they were going to give money to certain physicians, that meant that others were going to be cut. And that meant for general surgery up to a 10% cut. Some specialties were more, some specialties were less than that, which is clearly significant. And so the college really rallied around this issue and unfortunately had to make some decisions to not focus on other things. And the end result was that the cuts were averted for this year. So we were all sort of expecting up to an 8-10% cut. That is not happening in 2021. And the great reason was the pandemic, is that all of the issues with especially rural and private practice general surgery groups and specialty groups were not making ends meet, were closing their offices, which really affects patient care and access to care. And so there was the Omnibus Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021. And of course, as all things medical seems to do, it came in at the very last minute. This was a bill that was proposed on December 21st, and it was actually signed into law by past President Trump on 12/27. And there's a few details there. They're also implementing some of the service codes, the E&M codes, and there was a lot contained within that bill. One of the things I recently learned is they did approve 1,000 new residency slots, which we haven't expanded residency spots in quite some time, mostly for rural programs, places of need. But in order to get this accomplished, the college really worked hard and actually did something that they haven't done before, which is develop a coalition. They've always worked with coalitions, other surgical societies. However, they really formalized that into the, I think it's called the Surgical Care Coalition. I'll get into that in just a minute more, but really coalesced around a group of surgeons and group of professional organizations to move this really important large issue. There was great outreach through Surgeon's Voice that Dr. Doucet mentioned. It's a great, easy way to use it. But the grassroots effort to the legislators was noticed. They kind of weren't doing a whole lot, and they got an influx of emails and letters and phone calls, and all of a sudden there was a lot more activity and interest. And that really occurred in early December, and probably propagated getting this bill changed and passed through, because it wasn't written to look like this in November. But there's still additional action needed. Unfortunately, the cuts were averted only for 2021. So we will have to make an argument as to why access to care for these cuts is important. And then, of course, to thank the legislators that went to bat for this. This is just a screenshot of the website for the Surgical Care Coalition members. You can see it's not just general surgeons. American College of Surgeons is listed sort of in the middle of that list, but they really did act as the lead in both developing the coalition and pushing the legislation through. There also, the Care Coalition hired a advisory professional group that really did some great outreach and got some data behind this. So this was a new sort of way to do advocacy and to really learn how to pull everyone together into a larger coalition and make it sort of an advertised successful strategy. I also wanted to mention Surgeon's Voice and pulled up a screenshot here just to sort of say how easy it was. You can see if you go to surgeonsvoice.org, you can find this through the college website. There's lots of things you can just click on. I'll give you a little blurb about whichever the bill is, and then you can simply sign. And I have to admit, when I went to make this screenshot, it said, have you thanked your legislator? And I hadn't officially. And so I did that. And this was the little slide. It took literally 3 seconds. 129 actions have been taken. And I think it is really important that we all reach out and say thank you to the legislators, that they understood that this cut was really bad timing. And then it's even simply easy to share with your colleagues on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever it is that you like to use. In this most recent bulletin, Dr. Hoyt really outlined, along with Christian Chaljan, who's the executive director of the Advocacy Division in Washington, D.C., the timeline of how this went and worked with the Surgical Coalition, with the legislature kind of not moving on this, what the actions were that actually made things propagate and move on. So if anyone's interested in that, that's in the bulletin access either online or if you still get it sent to you as I do. The other really big topic that we spent a lot of time on last year is surprise medical billing. This has been coming up for a couple of years. Dr. Doucet mentioned here in California, and we do have a surprise medical bill here. However, what I did just learn is that only applies to state. There's state insurance companies. There's a lot of insurance companies in California that are federal, and so they fall under what will be a federal bill. And there's been some really bad options out there for physicians for negotiating settlements for these surprise medical bills or unanticipated medical bills that really put patients in the lurch. And a lot of the solutions by legislators are just to basically not pay the doctors or pay the surgeons. And there are bad actors out there, but this is something that does need to be looked at. And so this was also passed, and there is a negotiated settlement that can come through. It's not a perfect bill, but it was a nice compromise that had to be made. And this will also be coming back for additional work in the future. It was included in a COVID relief package. Speaking of COVID, I won't go through this, but I think this is particularly important for private practices. Although academic and university programs also benefited from some of the COVID relief bills, the college really worked hard on this, but particularly rural practices and private practices necessary with not closing. And of course, that then becomes a patient care issue as well. So there was a number of things, and the college really was a leader in those. Other things, of course, the other things didn't go away, and that list is still long. And when they would put input in, but many of these things were set. And apparently in DC, not much is moving through Congress right now after all of the attack on the Capitol. There's a lot of uncertainty about who will be working with who and what this will mean going forward with the new president in office. So a lot to be seen this year. We'll be meeting with HPAG early in March. I'll try to give you guys some updates from what the national office has and what we take out of that meeting, which will give us a little bit more time to see how Congress is going to act in today's current setting as well. Early things, though, that we know that will be worked on this year is, of course, the Medicare physician payment cuts, because those are still in effect to start in 2022, and really looking for a longer sustainable solution instead of doing 1-year bills. I think we all remember SGR and how miserable that was for many years. We don't want to get back in that situation. So working with the Congress to really come up with a good plan. More COVID release will be there. And then there's lots of other work to do for cancer care and trauma care and patient safety and quality overall. So that's what I have for you tonight. Thank you for letting me join you.
We have one question from our audience. Someone has asked, they've been active in advocacy and have found that the most effective advocates are patients who are affected by the legislation. How do we get our patients involved?
That's a really great question. I think it gets a little bit sticky because your patient has to sign off, and there could be some issues with your hospital. The patient, of course, can be encouraged to go to the legislator themselves, and that's something you can do probably offline. One of the things we have to be a little bit careful about with advocacy is what hat you're wearing when you're talking with your legislator. And so if you're talking to your legislator as a private citizen, as a physician with a patient, that is probably fine. You do want to be careful that you're not representing, especially if you work for a large organization, that the legislator knows whose voice you're representing. But that's definitely a great opportunity and way to do that. If you don't have a patient, or it becomes difficult to coordinate with the patient, taking that story as the representative of the patient is also a great opportunity. Dr.
And I would add on to that, in some of the states that have been successful with Stop the Bleed bills, amongst the most powerful testimony was given by those who were saved by Stop the Bleed techniques. And particularly in one state, they had a police officer who was saved with the use of a tourniquet, and that was pretty powerful testimony. So one way is to bring with you the office, but the other one is to have them go to committee hearings and testify, and that can be quite effective at the state and federal level.
I want to thank Dr. Doucet and Dr. Liepert, and we are going to move on. Feel free to continue to ask questions. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sawyer. Dr. Sawyer is an infectious disease specialist at Rady's Children's, but he has many titles over at Rady's. But the main reason we invited him is that he is actually on on several advisory groups that have to do with COVID-19. And specifically, he was called to work on the FDA's review of the vaccines that are currently out there, as well as one of the 11 people who are looking at it from the state level. So I thought, if you're like me, you probably have been bombarded with questions about the COVID vaccine. And as a surgeon, I can answer some questions, but I am certainly not an expert in the field. So I thought it might be helpful not just for me, but for probably most physicians who are not infectious disease doctors to talk about this, so that maybe we can have a little more education about kind of what the process was, what to expect, and so on and so forth. So again, if you have any questions, please ask them in the Q&A or in the chat, and I will be monitoring, but it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Sawyer.
Great. Thanks very much, Dr. Lee. It's a pleasure to join you all tonight. And I'm going to attempt to give you a quick run through on COVID and COVID vaccine. It's, as you all can appreciate, we're facing a big challenge right now in getting the public immunized and convincing a subset of the public to get immunized. And there are tons of evidence-based resources that show that patients look to their physicians as the most trusted source of information. So it's important that physicians are up to date with COVID and can communicate effectively with their patients about the importance of COVID vaccination. So these are my objectives for you, and then I'm gonna, in the next 25 minutes or so, hopefully make sure you're familiar with the current vaccine platforms and which ones are coming. Discuss the update on the safety, including the allergic reaction story that happened here in San Diego at Petco Park a week ago and what we know about allergies. Make sure you're aware and share with your patients what we don't know about SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. That's equally important with what we do know. And then at the end, you have some talking points about ways to quickly communicate key messages about COVID vaccines, and give you an up-to-date update on where we are with the variant strains and what risk those pose to this whole effort. I'm sure you've been following the stories of the surge in December and January. The good news is we're on the downswing now. All the indicators are beginning to drop, which is finally some good news in this large outbreak. But we are a long ways away from where we were in the summer. If you remember the colored tiers of restriction that California has, are on the right there: purple, red, orange, and yellow. And the numbers there indicate the thresholds that allow you to shift from one tier to the next. The numbers on the left are the last 4 weeks worth of those figures for San Diego County. So we are way off from ever getting out of the purple tier. If you remember, back in the summer, we managed to move to the red tier for a short period of time and then reverted. So these tiers affect everything, all the businesses in the community, the ability for schools to reopen. So it is really important that we get on top of this outbreak in Southern California. Just a quick overview of the multiple types of vaccines that are available. And the point of this slide is they all have a common endpoint, which is to present the spike protein to the immune system to generate an immune response. The spike protein is the major immunogenic protein of SARS-CoV-2 virus. We have all these different types of vaccines. You're most familiar with the nucleic acid vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, because those are the first two that have been approved. Coming down the pike in the next month are 2 viral vector vaccines, which engineer, in most cases, adenoviruses to carry a little bit of the viral RNA or DNA into the cell, but the end result is the same. It produces spike protein. There are pure protein-based vaccines that are under development, and there are actually whole virus, both live and killed viral preparations that are underway. But again, the endpoint is all the same at this point, which is both simplifies things, but also creates a major risk for us because all of the vaccines are targeting the same target. And as we get these variant strains starting to emerge, they may start to escape the effectiveness of vaccine, and we'll come back to that at the end. This slide just reiterates again the major types. So again, the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna have been issued their EUA already. You're very familiar with them. The next ones coming are the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca products. Those are both viral vector vaccines. If you were able to check the news today, Johnson & Johnson just filed with the FDA today to get their approval going, and it usually takes 2 or 3 weeks before that can happen. So I'm expecting that third vaccine now to be available by early March and help us with the burden of immunization, trying to get the whole community immunized. Some of you have heard about Novavax. They're into their phase 3 clinical trial. That's an example of a subunit vaccine. The inactivated whole virus vaccines are in the US still behind in the clinical trials, but the Chinese have a whole virus vaccine product that they're already using, which looks promising. And so there are just dozens of vaccines still under development. So it is hard to keep track of them. This slide shows the 6 vaccines that are supported by Operation Warp Speed, the federal funding that helped speed up the process of development. The main point is the size of the clinical trials that are required to get FDA approval. These are large clinical trials, and out of them we get the data that you've heard about in terms of both effectiveness and safety. The first 2 at the top, Moderna and Pfizer, you're familiar with. We've been using them now since December. The next 2, the AstraZeneca and Janssen or Johnson & Johnson vaccines, have completed their clinical trials, and we're just waiting for data accrual. And as I just said, the Janssen vaccine was submitted today to FDA. The others are Novavax just started their phase 3 clinical trial, so it's likely going to be a couple of months before that happens. The GSK product is not even into phase 3 clinical trials yet. So that's the landscape in the United States for vaccines. We're likely to be up to 4 vaccines by April or May, and that's going to hopefully carry us through the summer to get most people immunized. Just with regard to the speed with which these vaccines were produced, it's created anxiety in the general community. So here are a couple of quick points that you can share with your patients to explain why we were able to develop these vaccines so quickly. First of all, the NIH and CDC used existing research networks. For example, the HIV network that was been doing clinical trials for decades now across the United States. The resources of that network were harnessed to study the COVID vaccines. The money that came from the federal government allowed manufacturing to begin while the clinical trials were still underway, something that no company in their right mind would ever do if the money wasn't coming from the federal government. So they were literally producing vaccine as if they were going to market it before they even knew whether their vaccine worked. The mRNA technology is new and allows for faster development of vaccine, and that's going to be important. That may turn out to be important when it comes to these strain variants that are starting to hit the news, in that the company can turn around and make a new version that is active against the variant within just a few weeks from the identification of that variant. And then finally, FDA and CDC did a most ungovernment-like thing, and they started working weekends and nights and held multiple meetings at the same time and really pushed this through the regulatory process, to their credit. Just one slide on the approval process to make sure everybody's clear on how it works. The FDA's job is to determine whether products are safe and effective. They don't necessarily weigh in on who should get them or how they should be delivered. Both of the current vaccines and the ones coming up are released under what's called an emergency use authorization. That means technically they are still investigational drugs, and they have to be used very carefully under the guidance of that EUA. If you start wandering off of the recommended use from the EUA, you're potentially getting on thin ice from a medical legal point of view. That is usually followed within 4 to 6 months by a full licensure, and we are expecting that to happen with Moderna and Pfizer sometime in the next few months. After the vaccines are released to the public, the CDC issues recommendations. The ACIP, Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, make detailed recommendations. This is where the federal guidance about prioritization of who should get COVID vaccines, whether that we should delay the second dose, for example, which is a topic that's come up a lot to try to get more people immunized. Those sorts of recommendations come out of CDC. Dr. Lee mentioned that I'm a member of the Western State Scientific Review Work Group, which was a completely novel idea that is the governor of California, then followed by Oregon, Washington, and Nevada, decided that they wanted an independent voice to make sure we developed messages about the safety of the vaccine, and were able to reassure our local communities that the CDC and FDA process corners were not cut in those processes. So we have continued to review the data that's coming out, both pre-licensure and post-licensure, to make sure that we can be accurate in our communication about these vaccines. Very important in the conversations about these vaccines, and in fact all vaccines, is to keep in mind what is meant by vaccine effectiveness. So if you take any vaccine, there are a number of endpoints that you could measure. The classic is it prevents infection altogether. So you don't get infected, you have no symptoms. But a vaccine would be equally valuable to the community if you got infected but had no symptoms. So you might be able to transmit the infection, but at least you don't get any symptoms. You can prevent illness that's severe enough to bring you to the physician, which is how influenza vaccine is usually measured in effectiveness. You could just as equally value or measure effectiveness by whether it prevents hospitalization or ICU admission or death. And naturally, the effectiveness of any vaccine goes up as you go from left to right on this scale. So for the COVID vaccines, we've been talking about vaccine effectiveness at preventing symptomatic disease that then is verified by PCR testing. So this second from the left figure. And that's where the current effectiveness numbers are coming from. That's important because, as you may know, the early returns on the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is they're more like 70% effective at preventing symptoms. And so some in the community are going to consider them inferior to the mRNA vaccines, which are 95% effective at preventing symptoms. But those same vaccines that are 70% effective at preventing symptoms are closer to 90 or 95% in preventing death and ICU stay, which is ultimately a target that we need to strive for. What we don't yet know about any of these vaccines is, although we know it prevents symptoms, we don't know if it prevents infection and the ability to transmit to others. So that is an unknown which may require us to continue wearing masks, even if vaccinated, at least until we have good data on whether you could still transmit infection after vaccination. The other thing that's important about vaccines is they have different attributes. It's sort of like comparing a BMW to a Jeep. You know, they're both vehicles, but they have very different characteristics and potential advantages and disadvantages. Here's a summary of the 4 vaccines we're likely to have in this next 6 months: Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and AstraZeneca. I mentioned the effectiveness numbers already. 3 of the 4 of these vaccines are 2-dose products. The Johnson & Johnson has been studied as a 1-dose product. That's clearly a huge advantage from a public health delivery of vaccine standpoint. So although the effectiveness at preventing symptomatic disease is lower, the trade-off is you can give a single dose and achieve pretty good coverage. The vaccine storage, you've heard a lot about the Pfizer vaccine, which requires -70 storage. The newer viral vector vaccines can be stored in the refrigerator for up to 6 months. So that's going to definitely improve the ability to deliver vaccine from pharmacies, from small rural offices, and on the world scale in developing countries where keeping a cold chain is a challenge. You've probably heard about the allergic reactions that have been attributed to the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. We'll talk about those in a minute. We, of course, don't know yet whether we're going to see similar side effects from the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca. We really only learned about these allergic reactions once the vaccines were released to the community and literally millions of doses administered. And then a lot of effort has been placed on studying these vaccines in diverse communities because the burden of disease is not the same in different racial and ethnic groups. The immune response may or may not be the same, and it's important to demonstrate in every community for which we want to give vaccine that the vaccine is effective. That's where the AstraZeneca vaccine lags a little behind. There's less diversity in the clinical trials for that vaccine. So we'll have to stay tuned on that. And finally, if you look at the bottom line here, the cost of these vaccines is dramatically different. So again, from a World Health perspective, there's going to be a lot of interest in the AstraZeneca vaccine because it is much cheaper than the other vaccines. So I think, we can't be picky about vaccines. I think the general advice for the community in the next several months is take whatever vaccine you have the opportunity to get. They all generally work well. They all prevent severe disease and death, even if there are some differences in the effectiveness by the lesser measures that are in the news. I do want to emphasize the safety mechanisms which are in place. The details of all these acronyms on the left column are not that important, but suffice it to say that along with rapid development of the vaccines, the federal government has also developed a very intensive safety monitoring network that allows simultaneous or real-time monitoring of literally millions of people through electronic medical record surveillance, looking for strange side effects. So far, with close to 30 million doses of these vaccines being given, no strange and unusual side effects have emerged. The anaphylaxis is the main thing that is real and is fortunately still quite rare. But you can already reassure your patients if they're concerned that these vaccines are too new or were developed too quickly, that through these extensive vaccine safety monitoring systems, we have not uncovered any significant side effects. I'll point out one here called the VSD. This has been in place for a number of years, and it's really the best thing that came out of the vaccine hesitancy movement. The VSD is a network of groups like Kaiser. In fact, Kaiser is a major contributor to the VSD. Collectively, the VSD monitors around 10 million people all the time for unexpected side effects from vaccine or side effects that somebody raises as a possibility from a vaccine. The VSD will allow you to do, develop evidence-based evaluations of whether any purported side effect is or is not linked to the vaccine. So it's a very powerful system. It's being complemented by similar systems in the VA system and the FDA database using CMS. So we're really on top of these vaccines, more so than we ever have been with any other vaccines in the past. These are the current vaccine safety concerns. Everybody has heard about the systemic and local side effects that occur. For those of you who've had the vaccine, I suspect you experienced them yourselves. These are among the most reactogenic of vaccines that are in common use. They're very similar to the shingles or zoster vaccine. And so the side effects should not be minimized. People are going to feel miserable potentially for 24 hours after vaccination. They're going to have headache, fatigue, malaise. Many people are not going to be able to go to work the next day. That's particularly true in younger individuals and with the second dose of vaccine. So I don't know about the surgical group, but we've got tons of house staff in pediatrics who, when they get their second dose of vaccine, get fevers of 102, 103 for 24 to 36 hours and can't show up to work the next day. That's also happening in the general community. And what we don't want is for that to be translated into some concern about the vaccine. In fact, it's the opposite. When you generate a fever of 102, it means your immune system is really revving up and responding to the vaccine. So it's important to communicate ahead of time that patients can expect these local and systemic side effects and that they're actually good news, not bad news. The allergic reaction story is still evolving. The most recent data certainly verifies that anaphylaxis is more common with these COVID vaccines than influenza vaccine, for example. Influenza vaccine is usually, we usually see anaphylaxis at a rate of around 1 in a million doses. The Moderna vaccine is more like 2 to 3 in a million, and the Pfizer vaccine is around 5 in a million. So these are still extremely rare, but more common than with influenza. The importance of this is in the vaccine delivery process. It's very important that providers observe patients for at least 15 minutes after administration of vaccine. Almost all of the anaphylaxis cases have occurred within 30 minutes of vaccination, and many of them occur in people who have preceding histories of anaphylaxis to other things, or at least severe allergies in their history. Those people should be watched for 30 minutes. The average person getting vaccine should be watched for 15 minutes. There was an early signal in the clinical trials about Bell's palsy potentially being associated as a side effect. That's still being investigated. That has been seen with some other vaccines, by the way, and since Bell's palsy is felt to be an immunologic phenomenon, it's not too surprising that when you rev up your immune system, you may see that. Again, it remains extremely rare. And now for the messy stuff, that is vaccine distribution. You know, the community is getting a little bit fed up with the mixed signals and changing signals about delivery of vaccine. It boils down to the fundamental problem that we have a limited supply at this point in time, and it's going to require, therefore, we have to prioritize who's going to get vaccine first. The CDC spent a lot of time ahead of time sort of working through what that would look like, which is why healthcare workers, the elderly, people with high-risk medical conditions, racial and ethnic minority groups who have a disproportionate severity of disease, and essential workers who have a disproportionate exposure to disease should take priority over others. We've touched on the storage issues already, and it's going to be very important to track vaccine because at this point, we don't know whether these vaccines are interchangeable. So if you get the Moderna vaccine for dose 1, you should get Moderna for dose 2. In healthcare settings, that's pretty easy to keep track of. But once we start rolling out vaccine to the general community, people are going to forget which vaccine they got. They're going to go to different places for dose 2 than they got dose 1. So part of the challenge at the public health level is developing the databases and infrastructure to monitor who's gotten vaccine and what product they got. That's also going to be important for vaccine safety in case we identify products or lots of vaccine that have unusual side effects. We need to figure out who received those lots of vaccine. This is from the ACIP meeting in the fall where the anticipated rollout of vaccination was sort of worked out. And it just shows that we're in the red circle area right now, a period of limited availability of vaccine and very high demand. And that's leading to tensions out in the community. You've probably heard about the phases, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 1 is divided into 1A, 1B, and 1C. We are just stepping our toe into phase 1B, which includes essential health workers, adults 65 and above, and eventually will include patients with underlying high-risk conditions who are under 65 years of age. Part of the confusion is the guidance starts at the federal level, but both the state and the county health department have license to modify those recommendations based on their vaccine supply and the individual needs of their community. This is why you may hear that Los Angeles is doing something different than San Diego is. California is doing something different than Florida is. This has to do with the intentional ceding of some of the decision-making to the local public health authorities. The downside of that is it's led to a fair amount of confusion as people read different stories from different locations and don't understand why they're not getting access when somebody like them in another place is getting access. I can tell you the health department is spending lots of time devoted to this question. They have a community advisory group that I'm participating in, which is giving the county advice about what we think should happen in San Diego. And hopefully we're going to improve in the communication for the reasons behind the allocation scheme that you're seeing rolled out by the county. I think I'll skip through this in the interest of time, just to say that this prioritization scheme was based on very solid ethical principles, and any attempts to change the rollout prioritization need to keep those ethical principles in mind, particularly equity in distribution to populations that have access issues or are more likely to have severe outcomes from COVID disease. This slide is meant to sober us up about how long it's going to take to immunize everybody. If you just look at the phase 1A and 1B people in the United States, we're talking somewhere around 150 million people. So far, we've given about 30 million doses of vaccine. So we've got a long ways to go to get everybody immunized in the high priority group. So it is going to still be months before low risk general population individuals are going to be able to get vaccine. Of course, there is overlap between these groups, and that makes the job a little bit easier. And you may see some schemas of prioritization that say, okay, we're going to immunize essential workers who also have high-risk medical conditions or who are also 65 and above. That may be what comes out of some of the variation in recommendations. In San Diego, we've really done a pretty good job of, in the last weeks, of expanding the distribution. There are now up to 9 large points of distribution that the county is organizing in partnership with the various healthcare entities in San Diego. You've heard about the Petco Park station, which is being staffed by UCSD. They are ramped up to do close to 5,000 doses a day. Scripps and Sharp are also in the game, creating new pods. There's one in East County now, there's one in North County, there's one in South County. At the moment in San Diego, we're immunizing individuals 65 years of age and above, and healthcare workers of a wide variety of descriptions. So we're just beginning to do tier 1 of phase 1B. We are not yet immunizing teachers or other essential frontline workers, but I do expect that to start relatively soon. And last thing I'm going to cover before we open this up for questions are the variants. So SARS-CoV-2 is an RNA single-stranded virus. And those types of viruses are known to have a high rate of mutation or error rate as they replicate their genome. Influenza is another example of an RNA virus that we know changes from year to year because it has mutations that sometimes give it an advantage to be more contagious or more virulent. And that's happening with SARS-CoV-2. So it's no mystery that these variants are emerging. In fact, we probably still are only looking at the tip of the iceberg, because the only way you can identify these variants is to do sequencing. And that has been variably applied around the world and in the United States. It is ramping up now since these variants have been recognized. The ones you want to keep your eye on are B.1.1.7. That's the so-called United Kingdom variant, which was first identified in the fall. It is widespread and unfortunately seems to be more contagious than the first strains that were circulating around the world. And there are models that suggest we are going to have another spike of COVID in San Diego in the next couple of months because this strain is taking over. It currently makes up about 25% of the strain in San Diego. More concerning are the South African and Brazilian variants, which so far have not been seen in California, but are in the United States. The reason these are concerning is they have shown reduced effectiveness of the vaccine and the monoclonal antibodies that we're using to treat patients with COVID disease. So we're going to need to continue to monitor these to see at what point they have varied so much that the vaccine is no longer effective. The companies are all over this, though. They are already preparing new types of vaccine to cover the variants, but we're going to be chasing our tail potentially for months to come until we get the pandemic under control, because every person who gets SARS-CoV-2 infection is a breeding vessel for new variants to occur. And with billions of people getting infected, we're going to continue to see lots of variants. So we need a worldwide effort to get the pandemic under control if we want to get these variants under control. Just some unknowns about the variants. We don't know for most of them yet whether they're more contagious or virulent. There are now already reports that some of the variants, particularly the Brazil strain, can infect people who already were infected with SARS-CoV-2 and they get symptomatic disease. They may potentially affect the diagnostic testing because one of the targets for the PCR test is the spike protein, and if there are mutations in the nucleic acid sequence, the PCR may not work as well. I've mentioned both the monoclonals and the vaccines may not work as well either. So we've got a lot to learn about the variants. I'm going to end with a couple of points about communication. This is a draft of a program that CDC is trying to roll out across the country, trying to inspire confidence in the public about the need for and the safety of these vaccines. And this is where we all come in as healthcare providers, empowering healthcare providers to promote confidence by sharing the kinds of information that I've gone over with your patients when they raise questions about the vaccines. Here's a couple of frequently asked questions. This, I think, is my last slide. The vaccines do not cause false positive tests. It is okay to get the vaccines if you've already been infected, but there's no real urgency to do so in that natural infection protects you for at least 90 days, and the most recent data would suggest 180 days. So it's sort of a waste of vaccine for people to get immunized if they know they've already been infected. I mentioned already, we don't know whether the vaccine products are interchangeable or not. We don't know, there is no interval between the two doses, which is too long. We're trying hard to give the Moderna vaccine 4 weeks after the second dose, 4 weeks after the first, and Pfizer 3 weeks after. But if you go longer than that, it's okay. It does not affect the immune response. And again, remind people about the side effects because we don't want people to be caught off guard. I think I've pretty much covered most of this information already, so I'm going to wrap it up and open this up for questions or comments if we have time.
We have a few minutes. I know we're going a little bit over, but I don't think anyone would mind. Dr. Sawyer, first, I want to thank you again for presenting this for us. This has been very helpful, at least for me. I don't know about how everyone else feels, but this was a lot of very useful information. I do have, for myself, I have a question, and then there is a question in the Q&A. Probably the two most common questions I get is, number one, is it safe for pregnant women? And the second question I get is, when will the data be out for kids?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we don't have an answer for the question about pregnant women. There's no theoretical reason to be very concerned. This mRNA does not stick around. It doesn't get into the nucleus of cells. So at this point, what we have is endorsement by the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the CDC, and the American Academy of Pediatrics that it's okay for pregnant women to get immunized. We do know that pregnant women are at slight increased risk for bad outcomes, just like they are for influenza. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to counsel a pregnant woman, especially in a community where there's a lot of disease like San Diego right now, that the risk benefit probably favors immunization rather than deferring immunization until after pregnancy. With regard to children, there are studies already underway in children down to age 12 and plans for studies down to age 5 in the next few months. So by summertime, we're likely to have data. Those trials are not going to need to be as large because they're going to use immunobridging data as an outcome that will satisfy FDA. So I do expect vaccine to become available for children sometime in the summer.
Someone asked if they could get copies of the slide. We are recording this, and when we have it posted, we'll send out a notice to everybody. But I'm going to leave it up to Dr. Sawyer as to whether or not he'd be willing to share his slides with us.
Oh, absolutely. I will send them to you as soon as we finish.
Thank you. And then the last question is, You had mentioned there was an allergic reaction such thing that happened at Petco. Didn't know if you could touch on or speak about what happened.
Yeah, about 2 weeks ago now, seemed to be a cluster of various allergic reactions, including tingling of the tongue, numbness, some facial swelling. Nothing that met the definition of full anaphylaxis, but certainly concerning symptoms that allergic reactions were happening. And as a result of that, the lot of vaccine that was being used that day at Petco was put on hold by the state of California, all across California, until those cases were investigated more thoroughly. The lot continued to be used in other states around the country without seeing any such clusters. And after all the information was gathered from the Petco experience, the decision was that this was not anaphylaxis. They were more angioedema-like symptoms. There's no good explanation for why we saw a cluster, but the lot was released and has been used again, both in San Diego and throughout California, with so far, knock on wood, no additional clusters of allergic reactions.
We do have one additional question. What are the recommendations on vaccination of patients who have other medical conditions such as recent surgery, et cetera?
There should be no particular problem. Again, these are not live virus vaccines. The issue is the side effects and whether that's going to create a problem for you clinically if your patient gets fever or myalgia for a short period of time after vaccination. But in terms of the immune response, it should be fine immediately post-surgery. So if you have the opportunity to get your patient immunized, I would take advantage of it.
And then one additional question. You had reviewed the concept of effectiveness and showed that there was a difference between the Johnson & Johnson and the Moderna and Pfizer, but what is the effectiveness for these regarding hospitalization and death?
We don't have hard data yet. That's going to come out in the clinical trial data that's presented to FDA. So for Johnson & Johnson, we should learn that in the next couple of weeks because that data has now been submitted for review. What I've heard based on press releases from the company is that it's closer to 90 or 95% effective, but I think we have to wait till we get an independent review of the data to see exactly what the clinical trials have shown.
And then another question is, a few more questions have popped up. And I get this question a lot. Post-vaccination, thoughts on taking Tylenol or Advil if you've had symptoms?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's debate in my own family about this issue. So I can tell you there is no recommendation from CDC or anywhere else that you avoid taking antipyretics or anti-inflammatory agents before or after you are vaccinated. And there's a certain temptation to do that because of the fever and malaise that many people experience. The person asking that question might be aware that there's some data in children that if you take Tylenol before you get vaccinated, it blunts the immune response. It's not very solid data. Again, there's no recommendation, but I can tell you I did not take Tylenol or ibuprofen, and my daughter, who's also a physician, did, and we're in disagreement about whether that was a good or a bad idea.
And then another question, is there any increased risks in elderly patients with no spleen in getting the vaccine?
No, there should be no problem with asplenia in getting the vaccine at any age. The immune response, seems to occur in lymph nodes and local tissues. And I don't think there is likely that asplenia would interfere with a pretty good immune response. We get a good T cell immune response with these vaccines, so that should be fine.
I don't see any other questions. I don't know if anyone has any other questions. You can't, unfortunately, you won't be able to speak, but if you quickly type something, we'll do 30 more seconds or maybe 10 more seconds. Dr. Sawyer, again, thank you so much for doing this. This has been so helpful in at least giving me some more information as to things that I can tell my friends and family whenever they call me about things. For some people that are out there, I've become the go-to physician for them because I'm the only doctor they know. So really, this has been so helpful in giving us, at least allowing me to give more intelligible information to people who have questions about all these things. So if there's nothing else, thank you everyone for joining. I hope this has been as helpful for you as it was for me. And we will be having another session probably in May or June. I'm going to try and figure out how to do surgical jeopardy if possible on Zoom. I'm not sure if it is, but hopefully I'm hoping that that's the last Zoom session, and maybe by the fall we'll be able to do something maybe even small in person with Zoom or something like that. But again, Dr. Sawyer, thank you very much. And if there's any other questions or things, if people want to email me questions, I can forward them to Dr. Sawyer and see if I can get an answer. But otherwise, thank you again.
I'm happy to take email questions and happy to revisit all these issues in a few months, depending on what's happened.
We might be calling you, especially if these variants start to take hold. So
yeah,
thank you.
Have a good evening.
So thank you again. And everyone, thank you for joining, and hopefully we'll see you at the next session.